As you can imagine, everybody at the World Neolithic Congress was especially excited to see the site of Göbekli Tepe. It's been in the news for such a long time. There's been such spectacular narratives surrounding the site, if you will, and it really is a truly spectacular site. So we were all very excited to arrive there, and we were, in my particular excursion group, was able to visit the site around midday, which turned out to be quite a good time to see the site. As soon as I arrived in Şanlı Urfa, I was already being bombarded with proof of Göbekli Tepe's immense influence on modern culture in the region. There were replicas of the site's famous T-shaped pillars in parks around town and in traffic circles, and a full-blown, though not especially accurate, model of one of the famous buildings in front of the Navali Hotel, where many of the Congress participants were staying. A lot of businesses in Şanlı Urfa, like pharmacies and travel agencies, are also named after Göbekli Tepe. One of my favorites, while we rode the bus towards Göbekli Tepe itself, was a balloon ride business next to the highway called Göbekli Tepe Balloons. Once we left the highway and angled northwest towards Göbekli Tepe, we drove through rural farmland and slowly climbed the foothills of the Germuş Mountains. Eventually winding our way up to the off-site buildings that house the gift shop. After a brief stop there, the buses took us farther up the road to the small parking area near the southwest corner of the site. We then filed out and walked toward the huge new roofed area, first stopping briefly near the stone yard, the area where various grinding stones and small sculptured stones from the excavations were warehoused in rows. I noticed one stone in this yard with rows of cup holes, possibly an ancient game board. We approached the big enclosure along a broad boardwalk. Having heard complaints in some quarters that there were allegedly concrete paths that were damaging the site, I have to say that I was positively impressed by the apparent care with which these paths had been constructed, in such a way that they were suspended above the surface with minimal impact on the site itself. The same was true of the big roof, really more like a giant tent, that was supported on widely spaced steel posts so as to require as little damage to the site as possible. The archaeologists apparently dug soundings wherever one of these posts was destined to go, and this is one of the reasons that we now know a lot more about the small pre-pottery Neolithic A domistic structures at the site. Despite its larger size, this new structure is much less intrusive than the old cover over the northern area with its later PPNB structures. The steel pillars of that much heavier structure appear to be set on large concrete piers. Turning to the architecture under the big roof, it is truly spectacular. Here, I'm standing over Building C, with a view across to Buildings A to the left and B to its right. Building C is the largest building so far excavated here, some 30 meters in diameter as measured across its outermost walls. Its two central pillars are broken, so their tops are missing, but they're still pretty impressive, and would originally have been about 5 meters high. It appears they were smashed, perhaps deliberately, sometime during the Neolithic. They are set into sockets in platforms or low pedestals that, like the floor of the building, are cut out of the bedrock. Originally, Klaus Schmidt called this building the Circle of the Boars, because several of the peripheral pillars have depictions of wild boar. However, the big central pillar, shown here, actually depicts a fox, while the pillar behind it, pillar 27, shows a very muscular, long-tailed mammal, perhaps a leopard or something, sculpted in the round above a shallow relief boar. Pillar 12, at the south end of the building and behind the one just mentioned, has the famous relief of a number of birds, perhaps caught in a net, above a couple of wild boar, or perhaps a boar and a fox. To the left, or east of that pillar, is a damaged one, on which we can see just the bottom portion of a shallow relief that is rather difficult to interpret. The building has at least 2 concentric walls, and it's not obvious how anyone could access the narrow corridor between them. In fact, you have to wonder if it was completely out of use after they built the inner wall. It would appear likely that the innermost wall is a later construction, walling off peripheral areas that were not intended to be accessible anymore. And that's how it is interpreted in one of the more recent treatments of the stratigraphic sequence by Moritz Kinzel and Lee Clare, who suggest that the outer wall dates to late pre-pottery Neolithic A. Another that partially encases the birds in net pillar 12 dates to the earliest PPNB, while the inner wall that connects with 10 or 11 pillars dates to a later part of early PPNB. Moving counterclockwise around the roofed area, we next come to building D. This is arguably the most impressive of the 4 structures in this area, and according to the most recent stratigraphic analyses, is also one of the earliest. It's quite large, at 20 meters in diameter. Now that the floor is almost completely exposed, we can see that the 2 central pillars are set into, although only barely, raised pedestals that, as in building C, are cut right out of the bedrock, and a row of birds is shown in relief on the side of the pedestal. The pillars are perfectly preserved to a height of about 5.5 meters. They're also the clearest indication that the central pillars are anthropomorphic, as the reliefs show arms extending to rest hands on the belly of the pillar, and each has a finely decorated belt supporting a fox pelt loincloth. The inward-facing side of the pillar depicts a fox to the right of the arm's elbow. On the bedrock floor are a number of features and some heavy stone artifacts. There are also some large slabs positioned on some of the outer benches. And pillar 33 here is broken and has been reinstalled with the support of some stone masonry below it. Looking down on this building makes it hard to get a good sense of just how large these pillars are. The fact that we were able to walk through a full-size replica of Building D at the Şanlı Urfa Archaeological Museum helps to rectify that. Not only does this walkthrough emphasize how much the pillars tower over people, even the height of the surrounding benches is much greater than I'd suspected, something like 1.6 meters, and certainly much higher than you'd need just for seating. Many of the peripheral pillars in Building D are also quite impressive. Of these, the most infamous is Pillar 43, which shows 3 enigmatic arched objects across the top, each associated with a small animal icon, and several birds, a large scorpion, and a small headless man below. Martin Sweatman and some others have speculated that this pillar has astronomical significance, and even that it is a sort of date stamp that records the date of a comet impact or cometary airburst around 13,000 years ago. I'll try to do a separate video next year that deals with that theory and its skeptics in some detail. Because of the way it's positioned at the southwest edge of Building D, I couldn't capture a good view of Pillar 33's faces, which show several large birds and what may be water waves formed from the bodies of snakes on one side and a large rearing fox on the other. The inward edge below the pillar's head has borders formed of chevrons and snakes' heads, framing a sequence of 3 downward snakes, a so-called H symbol, a spider, 3 more downward winding snakes, what may be a goat, sheep, or aurochs, and a second spider. Another important pillar is Pillar 38, which, again, is very difficult to view properly from the boardwalk above it. Positioned at the southwest edge of the building, it shows a vertical sequence of a fox, a large wild boar, and 2 long-necked birds. An interesting feature of Building D is this large stone in the north wall with a hole in it. Some people call this a sighting stone, presumably with the implication that it was used to make astronomical observations. However, Even if this hole went through to the outside of the building, it would only sight on other buildings or the side of the hill, not on the sky. This nearly life-size statue of a wild boar, now in the Şanlı Urfa Archaeological Museum, was found on the slab-topped bench directly below this holed stone. Continuing around the circuit, we come next to building B. Some 10 meters in diameter, its two central pillars have prominent reliefs of a fox on their inner surfaces, leading Klaus Schmidt to have originally called this the Fox Temple enclosure. One of its important features is a so-called portal stone, originally found in the lower part of the fill in the building. I've speculated that these things might be the borders of monumental hearths, but the current excavators assure me that they have good evidence that these things occur in roof fall, demonstrating that they are actually door frames for roof entries. Apparently, the floor here is lime plaster rather than bedrock over at least part of its surface. Another interesting feature is a window-like opening in the north wall, in the same position as the hold stone in Building D. What you can't see here is that, much deeper down and to the left or west, one of the deep soundings for the roof supports encountered a decorated portal stone built into what seems to be an earlier wall of this building, built right on the bedrock. If so, then Building B, like Building C, must have been rebuilt with a smaller plan than it originally had. Built into the southern wall is Pillar 6. On the outer edge of its head, there's a downward crawling quadruped with a thick tail, and possibly a snake below that. Since these face away from the center of the building, it's not clear whether these images would have been visible once the wall was constructed, suggesting that this pillar may have been moved. However, this wall, according to Kinzel and Clare's stratigraphic analysis, is not the original outer wall and dates to the latest PPNA or very early PPNB, while the traces of the original wall, a couple of meters south of the pillar, and still hidden in the bulk in this aerial photo, is probably somewhat earlier in PPNA. Moving farther south, we come finally to Building A. This was the first of these buildings to be excavated, and according to Kinzel and Clare, most of what we see here is also quite a bit younger than Buildings B, C, and especially D. Only the outermost walls date to pre-Paleolithic A, but all the walls built against the pillars reportedly date to middle PPNB. They also depart considerably from the usual oval plan, showing an almost rectangular one instead, with a somewhat apse-like curvature only at the northern end. Pillar 1, its westernmost pillar, has a relief of woven snakes on its inner face, with a small image of what appears to be a sheep at lower right. Pillar 2, the other central pillar, is damaged on the top, but its inner face shows an aurochs, a fox, and a long-legged bird, perhaps a crane. Notably, the portrayal of the aurochs with its head turned to emphasize its horns was the common way to show this animal at the time. This one looks very similar, for example, to the aurochs in the bench relief at Seybourge. The tops of many of the pillars show rows of cut marks, which some people used to speculate, back when many people thought these buildings were unroofed, were for lamps or some such. More likely, these are just traces of the methods that the ancient stoneworkers used to shape the stones, chipping away at them with stone hammers and perhaps using stone drills, and they were left like this because the upper surfaces were never meant to be seen. The more visible surfaces, by contrast, were smoothed with grinding stones. A number of the pillars instead show grooves in their tops, no doubt meant to receive wooden beams as part of the roofing framework. Some pillars also have round holes in them, again, likely so that wooden beams could be inserted there. A couple have both a groove and a hole. It's worth noting that wooden beams and steel cables are used to keep the ancient pillars from toppling over. Presumably, these pillars could never have remained upright without the stabilizing framework of the roof beams. Nowadays, almost all archaeologists agree that these buildings had roofs, whether or not they looked exactly as I reconstructed them back in 2011, or more recently when I reconstructed Building C with a thatched roof. Just north of the big roofed area with its impressive buildings is the older roofed area, which covers some later pre-pottery Neolithic B buildings. The paths don't enter that area, so I wasn't able to capture any very meaningful video, but that's where the so-called Lion Temple building is, even though the lions are nowadays described instead as leopards because they're males without manes. The leopard is rearing, or perhaps leaping, to attack. One path winds around that northern area, providing fantastic vistas of the northeastern corner of the Haran Plain and leading up to the summit of the hill. There we find a solitary tree, a ziyaret or wishing tree, where people would tie bits of string or cloth to make a wish. From this vantage point, we could also see the newer excavation areas in the northwest part of the site, north of the third roofed area. That roofed area was not open to us that day, apparently because of some dangerous stretches of the boardwalk. But it's over there that we'd find the bedrock floor for Building E, where we can see the sockets for the central pillars. Incidentally, numerous rumors about the alleged cessation of excavation at Göbekli Tepe are belied by this northwest excavation field. Those excavations will continue, I'm told, in 2026. That northern boardwalk eventually winds its way down to the western extension from the main excavation area, where the excavations expose more of the pre-pottery Neolithic B rectangular houses. These aren't as well preserved as one might like, being exposed to the elements, and some of the stone pillars have been encased in wooden boxes to protect them. The orientations of the walls in this part of the site suggest the possibility that the PP&B buildings are concentrically arranged around the hilltop. At the westernmost end of this trench is Building F, another of the round PPNA special buildings. It's similar in size to Building B, but with a completely different orientation. Most of its pillars are also not fully preserved, likely because this building was not as deeply buried as in the main area of excavation. This has led some people, incorrectly, to assume that this building is later than the large ones in the main excavation area. In fact, it's only higher and shallower because Göbekli Tepe is on a series of hills, and this building happens to be on the western slope of one of those hills. There was also some exposed bedrock in this area, where you could see cup marks, probably used for nut cracking or crushing nuts. We next followed the boardwalk down the west slope of this southwestern hill toward the stone yard, boarded the buses, and headed for our next destination, the new excavations at Sefer Tepe.